he was never comfortable in being out front. He was, his name was Leonard Sly at that time, so obviously he didn't have the famous name yet, and he struggled like the rest of the guys. Give you one little story on how bad things were back in those days. The guys would get together, and sometimes they would make money, sometimes they would lose it. Sometimes they had management that took the money and took off and left them sitting there. My dad had to hawk his watch to get out of a hotel bill one time. So, but they would go into a restaurant, show you how bad things were bad, and for everybody in those days, but musicians especially, because they didn't have the jobs that were steady. So they would go into a restaurant, they'd sit around and wait for the waitress to come around. She'd come around and give them water in glasses, and then they say, well, I'll come back and take your order. They said, because we don't know what we want yet. The waitress would leave, the guys would take the ketchup bottle and pour it into the water that was on the table. That was what they had for breakfast. They would put salt and pepper in it, drink it, and then leave whatever money they had in their pocket for a tip for the waitress. That's how bad things were back then. But that was the way the guys were. And for all of us, our job is to continue on that wonderful, not only their music, but the attitude and the love they have for the music. And so, and I mean, I remember Dad, you've probably seen him do the Cooper mount, which is where the horse, he would have Trigger. All he had to do was say to Trigger, stand, Trigger. Trigger would stand there. He didn't be tied to anything. He would stand completely still, and Dad would run up behind him and do that jump, hit hands on his rump, and then jump into the saddle. We used to watch Dad do that when we were kids at the ranch. And Trigger, horses have a personality just like a lot of kids do. And they will do stuff to you that they know they can try to get away with. And some days they have good days and some bad. But Trigger was a jokester, and Dad was he'd stand Trigger, and he'd put him up against the fence so that he wouldn't run forward while he was training him. And so Dad would stand Trigger, and he came running up. Well, just about the time he took the jump to put his hands on his rear, Trigger stepped aside, Dad ran into the fence. So it's the kind of a thing he could do, and he knew every trick. He would anticipate what Dad would want. Dad didn't have to, if you see him riding fast in a series where Trigger would run, look like wide open, Dad would ride at a certain speed, and when he needed to catch up with the bad guys, all he did was run his hand up his neck. You wouldn't see it on camera, but he would just run his hand up his neck, and the farther he ran it up, the faster Trigger would go. So this is the kind of a horse he was. He was almost human-like, and when Trigger passed, Dad said it was like losing one of the kids. I mean, we didn't even know Trigger had passed for over a year because Dad couldn't tell us what happened to him. So it was tough. It was tough for him. But Trigger and Bullet and Buttermilk are in the Cowboy Hall of Fame, if you want to know, down in Texas in Fort Worth. So they're still around.